The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's General Hospital hummed their familiar tune as Sarah Chen finished her rounds on the third floor. It was 11:47 p.m. on October 15, 1995, and the autumn wind rattled the windows of the aging medical facility in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Sarah had been working the night shift for 3 years, ever since graduating from nursing school, and she knew every creak and whisper of the old building. At 26, she was one of the younger nurses on staff, but her dedication and gentle bedside manner had already earned her the respect of doctors and patients alike. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. Sarah pulled her cardigan tighter as she made her final medication rounds. The October chill had settled deep into the hospital's bones, and the old heating system struggled to keep up. Room 314 housed Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman recovering from hip surgery who always asked about Sarah's family back in California. Room 316 was Mr. Rodriguez, a construction worker who'd fallen from scaffolding and was fighting a difficult recovery. These weren't just patients to Sarah. They were people with stories, fears, and families waiting for them at home. "You heading out soon, honey?" called Nurse Margaret Walsh from behind the nurses' station. At 52, Margaret had been working nights at St. Mary's for over a decade and had taken Sarah under her wing from day one. Her Irish accent, softened by years in Iowa, carried the warmth that made her a favorite among both staff and patients. "Just finishing up with Mr. Rodriguez's pain medication," Sarah replied, checking her watch. "Should be out of here by midnight." She had plans to stop by the 24-hour diner on Highway 30, not for food, but to use their payphone. Her apartment didn't have long-distance service, and she'd promised to call her sister Jenny in Sacramento before it got too late on the West Coast. Margaret nodded, returning to her paperwork. The night shift was always quieter, with only essential staff remaining. Dr. Peterson was on call, sleeping in the doctor's lounge. Security guard Frank Morrison made his rounds every hour, his heavy footsteps echoing through the corridors. And somewhere in the basement, maintenance worker Dale Tucker was fixing the perpetually broken boiler that kept the hospital's aging infrastructure running. As Sarah administered Mr. Rodriguez's medication, she noticed his wife's photo on the nightstand, a young woman with kind eyes holding a toddler. "She's beautiful," Sarah said softly. "What's your little one's name?" "Maria Elena," he whispered through the pain medication's haze. "She just turned 2 last month. Rosa, my wife, she brings her every Sunday, but—" His voice trailed off as sleep began to claim him. Sarah adjusted his blanket and dimmed the lights. These moments reminded her why she'd chosen nursing, despite her parents' hopes that she'd become a doctor like her older brother. There was something sacred about caring for people in their most vulnerable moments, about being the steady presence that helped them through their darkest hours. The hospital felt different after midnight. Sounds carried farther in the emptiness, the distant hum of machines, the occasional call bell, the night janitor's cartwheels squeaking down the hallway. Sarah gathered her belongings from the small break room, her nursing school textbook on pharmacology, a half-eaten sandwich she'd never finished, and the small jade bracelet her grandmother had given her before she'd left California. She stopped by Margaret's station to sign out. "Everything quiet?" Margaret asked, barely looking up from her charts. "Mr. Rodriguez might need checking around 2 a.m. if his pain flares up again," Sarah noted. "Mrs. Patterson was asking about her daughter's visit tomorrow. Other than that, peaceful night." Margaret made notes in her log. "Drive safe, dear. That fog's rolling in thick tonight, and your little Honda isn't much match for these Iowa roads." Sarah had noticed the fog during her break, creeping across the parking lot like ghostly fingers. October in Iowa could be unpredictable, warm afternoons giving way to bone-chilling nights, with weather systems rolling in from the Great Plains without warning. But she'd driven in worse conditions during her years here, and the route to her apartment was familiar. Left out of the hospital, straight down Kirkwood Boulevard to the intersection with Collins Road, then a right turn into the Meadowbrook Apartments complex. As she walked toward the elevator, Sarah's mind wandered to her sister's latest letter. Jenny was pregnant with her first child and had been urging Sarah to move back to California. "Cedar Rapids is too small for someone with your talents," she'd written. "You could work at UC Davis Medical Center, be closer to family, maybe even meet someone special." The truth was, Sarah had been considering it more seriously lately. Not because Cedar Rapids felt too small, but because she felt ready for a new challenge, a new chapter. The elevator arrived with its familiar ding, and Sarah stepped inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. Through the small window she could see the fog thickening around the parking lot lights, creating halos of amber in the darkness. Her Honda Civic sat in its usual spot near the emergency exit, a reliable companion through 3 Iowa winters. As the elevator descended, Sarah thought about the conversation she'd have with Jenny tonight. Maybe it was time to start seriously considering that move to California. Maybe it was time to be closer to family, to start thinking about her own future, about the life she wanted to build beyond these hospital walls. The elevator doors opened to the ground floor, and Sarah stepped into the dimly lit lobby. Frank Morrison was nowhere to be seen, probably making his rounds on the upper floors. The automatic doors swooshed open as she approached, and the October air hit her face like a cold slap. The fog was thicker than she'd realized, reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet. Streetlights appeared and disappeared like ships in the night, and the familiar landmarks of the hospital grounds seemed foreign and distorted. Sarah pulled her keys from her purse and walked briskly toward her car, her footsteps echoing off the wet pavement. She had no way of knowing that these would be the last steps anyone would ever see her take, that in less than an hour her empty Honda would be found idling in the middle of a cornfield 12 miles outside of town, her purse still on the passenger seat, her keys in the ignition, and no trace of Sarah Chen anywhere to be found. The call came into the Lynn County Sheriff's Department at 2:17 a.m. A farmer named Harold Kozlowski had been checking on his pregnant sow when he noticed headlights cutting through the fog in his back 40 acres. "I thought maybe it was kids parking out there," he told Deputy Sheriff Michael Torres. "But when I went to check, there was just this little blue car sitting there running, driver's door wide open, nobody around." Deputy Torres arrived at the scene within 20 minutes, his patrol car's headlights cutting through the dense fog that had settled over the Iowa countryside. The Honda Civic sat in the middle of the cornfield like an abandoned island, its engines still running, windshield wipers moving back and forth across glass that had collected the night's moisture. The driver's door hung open at an odd angle, as if someone had exited quickly or been pulled out. Harold Kozlowski, a weathered man in his 60s wearing a barn coat over his pajamas, met Torres at the edge of the field. "Been farming this land for 37 years, he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "Never seen anything like this. Car's been sitting there for maybe an hour, judging by how deep the tires sank into the soft ground." Torres approached the vehicle carefully, his flashlight beam dancing across the scene. The Honda's registration was in the glove compartment. Sarah M. Chen, age 26, address listed as Meadowbrook Apartments on Collins Road. Her purse sat undisturbed on the passenger seat, wallet intact with $43 in cash and all credit cards present. A nursing textbook lay open on the floor of the passenger side. Most puzzling was her jade bracelet, found on the ground near the driver's door, its delicate chain broken as if it had been torn off in haste. "You know this girl?" Torres asked Kozlowski, showing him Sarah's driver's license photo. The farmer squinted at the image. "Never seen her before. Don't know why she'd be out here. This field doesn't connect to any main roads. You'd have to know the area pretty well to end up here, and even then, you'd have to drive through 2 other fields and cross that creek bed. Torres radioed for backup and called in the missing person report. Within an hour, the scene was swarming with sheriff's deputies, the state patrol, and investigators from the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation. The fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing the true remoteness of the location. The cornfield sat nearly 3 miles from the nearest farmhouse, accessible only by a series of dirt roads that would be treacherous even in good weather. Detective Linda Vasquez arrived from Cedar Rapids just after dawn. A 15-year veteran of the force, she'd worked dozens of missing person cases, but something about this scene felt different. "Tell me about the route from the hospital to her apartment," she instructed Torres, spreading a county map across the hood of her patrol car. "Direct route would be Kirkwood Boulevard to Collins Road," Torres traced with his finger. "Maybe 10-12 minutes on a clear night. But to get to this field, she would have had to drive east on Highway 30, turn north on County Road V77, then follow at least 3 different farm roads. We're talking a 30-minute drive minimum, and that's if you knew exactly where you were going." Detective Vasquez studied the map, then looked back at the Honda, sitting incongruously in the middle of the harvested corn stubble. "Any signs of struggle at the hospital?" "I sent units there first thing. Security guard confirms she signed out normally around midnight. Her supervisor, Margaret Walsh, said everything seemed normal when Sarah left. No indication of any distress or unusual behavior." As the morning progressed, more details emerged that deepened the mystery. The hospital's parking lot security camera had captured Sarah walking to her car at 12:03 a.m., but the fog had been too thick to see her clearly after that. Her apartment complex manager confirmed that Sarah had never made it home. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it that morning, even her coffee mug still sitting in the sink. Margaret Walsh arrived at the hospital early when she heard the news, her face pale with worry. "Sarah was like a daughter to me," she told Detective Vasquez. "She was responsible, careful, never took unnecessary risks. And she was excited about calling her sister in California last night. She'd been talking about it all week." "Did she mention stopping anywhere else after work?" Vasquez asked. "The diner on Highway 30, to use their payphone, but I called there this morning. The night manager said she never showed up." As investigators canvassed the area around the cornfield, they found more questions than answers. Tire tracks in the soft soil suggested that another vehicle had been present, but the fog and overnight dew had obscured most of the evidence. A search team with tracking dogs followed various scent trails, but they led nowhere conclusive. The most disturbing discovery came when investigators examined the exact spot where the Honda had been found. Harold Kozlowski led them to a depression in the earth about 50 yards from where the car sat. "This here's an old well," he explained. "Been covered over for maybe 20 years, but the ground's still soft. Family that farmed here before me lost a cow down there once." Detective Vasquez felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning. The covered well sat in a direct line between where Sarah's car had been found and a cluster of old farm buildings that had been abandoned since the 1960s. She ordered the area cordoned off and called for ground-penetrating radar equipment. By afternoon, news of Sarah's disappearance had spread throughout Cedar Rapids. St. Mary's Hospital was buzzing with worried conversations, and several of Sarah's co-workers had called in sick, unable to focus on their duties. The hospital administrator, Dr. Richard Henley, held an emergency meeting with all night shift personnel. "I want everyone to think carefully about last night," he told the assembled group. "Anything unusual? Anyone you didn't recognize? Any strange phone calls or visitors? Sarah is one of our own, and we're going to do everything we can to help find her." But it was Frank Morrison, the security guard, who provided the most intriguing lead. "I was making my rounds around 12:30, he told Detective Vasquez. "I noticed this van in the parking lot that I hadn't seen before, dark-colored, maybe blue or black. Ohio plates, I think, but I didn't get the full number. When I came back around at 1:30, it was gone. Did you see anyone near the van?" "Too foggy to see much of anything, but I remember thinking it was odd. Someone visiting that late on a Sunday night. We don't usually get emergency visitors that time of night unless there's been an accident or something." The Ohio license plate detail sent investigators scrambling. A statewide BOLO was issued for any dark-colored vans with Ohio plates, and the Cedar Rapids Police Department began checking with local hotels and motels for any recent registrations from Ohio. As the first day of the investigation drew to a close, Sarah's family began arriving from California. Her parents, David and Helen Chen, looked shell-shocked as they sat in Detective Vasquez's office. David, a radiologist at UC Davis, kept asking technical questions about the investigation process, while Helen clutched a recent photograph of Sarah taken at a family barbecue the previous summer. "She was supposed to call Jenny last night," Helen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jenny waited up until 3 a.m. California time. When Sarah didn't call, Jenny knew something was wrong. Sarah never missed a promised phone call." Jenny Chen Williams had flown in from Sacramento that afternoon, pregnant and exhausted from the cross-country trip. "Sarah was thinking about moving back to California," she told Detective Vasquez. "We'd been talking about it for months. She was excited about the possibility, but she wanted to finish out her commitment at the hospital first. She's not the type to just disappear." As evening fell on October 16, 1995, search teams prepared for another night of looking for any trace of Sarah Chen. The cornfield had yielded no additional clues. The well had been searched with no results, and the mysterious van remained unidentified. But Detective Vasquez had a feeling that this case was just beginning, that the answers lay somewhere in the fog-shrouded events of that October night, waiting to be discovered by someone who knew where to look. 3 weeks into the investigation, the Sarah Chen case had grown cold, despite the intensive efforts of local, state, and federal law enforcement. The FBI had been called in when investigators discovered that the mysterious Ohio van had been reported stolen from a Cleveland hospital parking lot 2 days before Sarah's disappearance. The theft had gone unnoticed for nearly a week, buried in routine police reports, until Detective Vasquez's inquiry brought it to light. Agent Rebecca Morrison, no relation to the security guard, set up a command center in the Cedar Rapids Federal Building. A 20-year veteran of the Bureau's Violent Crimes Unit, she'd worked similar cases across the Midwest and recognized patterns that local investigators might miss. "Interstate vehicle theft connected to a disappearance suggests we're dealing with someone who plans carefully," she told the assembled task force. This wasn't random. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald, an 82-year-old widow who lived in a farmhouse near County Road V77, called the Sheriff's Department on November 7th. She'd been hesitant to contact authorities, she explained, because her own family often dismissed her observations as the confused ramblings of an elderly woman. "I was having one of my sleepless nights," she told Detective Vasquez when the investigator came to interview her. "Around midnight on October 15th, I heard vehicles on the road. That's unusual because that road doesn't really go anywhere except to the old Morrison farm. That's Frank Morrison's family land, though it's been empty for years since his father died." Detective Vasquez felt her pulse quicken. Frank Morrison, the security guard at St. Mary's Hospital, had never mentioned having family property in the area where Sarah's car was found. "Can you describe what you heard, Mrs. Fitzgerald?" "2 vehicles, I'm certain of that. The first one came by around midnight, driving fast like someone was in a hurry. Maybe 20 minutes later, another vehicle came along, driving much slower, like they were being careful or looking for something. About an hour after that, I heard just one vehicle going back toward the highway. Mrs. Fitzgerald's farmhouse sat on a small rise that gave her a clear view of the road system leading to the abandoned Morrison property. From her kitchen window, she could see headlights from nearly a mile away on clear nights, though the fog on October 15th had limited her vision significantly. "I should have called right away," she said, wringing her hands. "But my son always tells me I imagine things, that I should mind my own business. It wasn't until I heard about that poor nurse on the news that I realized what I might have seen." Agent Morrison immediately ordered surveillance on Frank Morrison, while Detective Vasquez obtained warrants to search the abandoned Morrison farm. The property hadn't been occupied since 1987, when Frank's father had died and left the 160-acre farm to his only son. Frank had tried unsuccessfully to sell the land, but had been unable to find buyers interested in the remote property with its aging buildings and poor road access. The search of the Morrison farm revealed evidence that someone had been using the property recently. Tire tracks in the barn matched the tread pattern from the stolen Ohio van. More disturbing were the personal items found in the farmhouse basement: a small collection of jewelry, identification cards, and photographs that appeared to belong to different women from various states spanning the previous 5 years. Among these items, investigators found a letter addressed to Sarah Chen at St. Mary's Hospital. It was postmarked October 10, 1995, 5 days before her disappearance. The letter was from a patient named Dorothy Kellerman, thanking Sarah for her kindness during a difficult hospital stay the previous month. "Sarah was an angel," the letter read. "She stayed with me during my panic attacks and helped me feel less alone. I will never forget her kindness, and I wanted her to know that people like her make all the difference in the world." The letter provided investigators with their first concrete link between Frank Morrison and Sarah Chen. Hospital employment records showed that Frank had specifically requested to work the night shift after Dorothy Kellerman's stay, which coincided with when Sarah was working her regular rotation. Security badge records revealed that Frank had made several rounds on Sarah's floor that were not part of his official duties. When investigators brought Frank Morrison in for questioning on November 10, 1995, he initially maintained his innocence. A lean man in his mid-30s with thinning brown hair and pale eyes, Frank had worked at St. Mary's for 8 years and had no criminal record. His co-workers described him as quiet, reliable, but somewhat antisocial. "I barely knew Sarah Chen," he told Agent Morrison during his initial interview. "She was just one of the nurses. I might have said hello to her a few times, but that's about it." But when confronted with evidence from the farmhouse and Mrs. Fitzgerald's testimony, Frank's story began to change. He admitted to having noticed Sarah during her rounds, to paying attention to her schedule, but insisted he'd never approached her directly. "She seemed different from the other nurses," he said, his voice growing quieter. "She actually cared about people, you know. Most of them just went through the motions, but Sarah, she would sit with patients who were scared, talk to them like they mattered." Agent Morrison pressed him about the night of October 15th. "Where were you between midnight and 2 a.m., Frank?" "I was working my shift. You can check the time cards." "We did check. You logged in at 11 p.m. and logged out at 6 a.m., but there's a 2-hour gap in your security rounds between midnight and 2 a.m. Your supervisor noted it in his report." Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sometimes I take longer breaks. The job gets boring, you know. I might have dozed off in the break room." But security cameras at the hospital told a different story. Footage showed Frank leaving the building through a service entrance at 11:47 p.m., just minutes after Sarah had signed out. He didn't return until 2:15 a.m., entering through the same service door and immediately resuming his normal patrol pattern. The physical evidence was mounting, but investigators still needed to find Sarah Chen. Frank Morrison's farm had been thoroughly searched with no trace of her, and he continued to deny any involvement in her disappearance. It wasn't until investigators began examining his personal history more closely that the true scope of the case became clear. Frank Morrison's employment history showed a pattern of short-term jobs at hospitals and medical facilities across the Midwest over the previous decade. In each location, he'd worked for 6 months to 2 years before moving on, often leaving just after unexplained incidents or policy violations that weren't serious enough for criminal charges, but serious enough to cost him his job. Most disturbing was what Agent Morrison discovered when she cross-referenced Frank's employment history with missing person reports from the same time periods and geographic areas. Over the past 8 years, 6 women had disappeared under suspicious circumstances in towns where Frank Morrison had been employed. All were healthcare workers. All had vanished during or just after night shifts. None had ever been found. "We're dealing with a serial predator," Agent Morrison told the task force. "Sarah Chen wasn't his first victim, and if we don't find him soon, she won't be his last." But Frank Morrison had stopped talking. After the second day of questioning, he'd requested a lawyer and refused to provide any additional information about his whereabouts on October 15th or his knowledge of Sarah's disappearance. The evidence was strong enough to charge him with kidnapping, but without Sarah's body or a confession, prosecutors worried about securing a conviction. As November turned to December, the investigation expanded to include cold cases from across the Midwest. Families of missing women began contacting the Cedar Rapids Police Department, hoping that Frank Morrison's arrest might finally provide answers to their own tragedies. The case that had begun as a single missing person report had become a multi-state investigation into what appeared to be one of the most prolific serial killers in recent Midwest history. Sarah's family remained in Cedar Rapids, refusing to return to California without answers. Her father had taken a leave of absence from his medical practice, and her mother spent her days walking the roads around the Morrison farm, searching for any sign of her daughter. Jenny, now in her second trimester of pregnancy, coordinated with media outlets to keep Sarah's story in the public eye. "We're not giving up," Jenny told reporters gathered outside the Lynn County courthouse. "Sarah is still out there somewhere, and we're going to find her. Frank Morrison knows where she is, and eventually he's going to tell us." But as winter settled over Iowa and the case approached its 2-month mark, investigators were beginning to face the possibility that Sarah Chen might never be found, that Frank Morrison might take his secrets to prison, and that 6 families across the Midwest might never know what happened to their daughters, sisters, and mothers. The only certainty was that on a foggy October night in 1995, something terrible had happened on the road between St. Mary's Hospital and the Meadowbrook Apartments, something that had torn Sarah Chen away from the life she was building and the family who loved her. And somewhere in the vast agricultural landscape of Iowa, the truth waited to be discovered by someone who refused to give up hope. Frank Morrison was convicted of kidnapping in April 1996 and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Despite overwhelming circumstantial evidence and his inability to account for his whereabouts during Sarah's disappearance, he never confessed to killing her or any of the other missing women. The conviction brought some measure of justice, but for Sarah's family and the families of the other victims, the lack of closure was agonizing. The Chen family returned to California after the trial, but David and Helen never fully recovered from their daughter's disappearance. David retired early from his medical practice, and Helen became an advocate for missing persons' families, working with organizations across the country to improve law enforcement response to disappearance cases. Jenny named her daughter Sarah Elizabeth in honor of her missing sister. And as little Sarah grew up, she heard countless stories about the aunt she would never meet. Detective Vasquez continued working the case for 3 more years before taking early retirement. The investigation had consumed her, and the lack of resolution haunted her dreams. She'd interviewed Frank Morrison dozens of times in prison, trying different approaches, appealing to his conscience, even bringing Sarah's mother to face him directly. Frank never wavered from his claim of innocence, never showed remorse, never gave any indication of where Sarah might be found. He's a sociopath. Prison psychologist Dr. Michael Torres, no relation to the deputy, concluded after extensive evaluation. He shows no empathy for his victims or their families. In his mind, he's done nothing wrong, which makes it highly unlikely he'll ever provide information about their locations. As the years passed, the Sarah Chen case became one of those stories that haunted the Cedar Rapids community. St. Mary's Hospital established a memorial garden in her honor, and nursing students from the University of Iowa would often visit to pay their respects to a colleague they'd never known, but whose dedication to patient care had become legendary. Margaret Walsh, Sarah's supervisor, took early retirement in 2001. She'd never been able to work the night shift again after October 15, 1995. "Every time I walked those halls after midnight, I could see her," Margaret told a local reporter on the case's 10th anniversary. "Sarah was the kind of nurse who reminded you why healthcare is a calling, not just a job. The world is darker without her light." The other victims' families formed an informal support network, meeting annually on the anniversary of Sarah's disappearance. They called themselves the Waiting Families, and their gatherings were both heartbreaking and hopeful. Heartbreaking because none of their loved ones had ever been found, hopeful because they refused to let their stories be forgotten. Frank Morrison's property was eventually sold by the county for unpaid taxes. The new owner, a corn farmer named Bill Patterson, had the old buildings demolished and converted the entire property to cropland. For years, whenever he plowed the fields, Patterson kept watch for anything unusual: clothing, jewelry, bones. But he never found anything connected to the missing women. In 2005, 10 years after Sarah's disappearance, Agent Morrison published a book about the case titled "Vanished in the Fog: The Search for Sarah Chen and the Other Lost Daughters." The book became a bestseller and renewed public interest in the case. Morrison donated all proceeds to the National Center for Missing Adults and used her platform to advocate for better interstate cooperation in missing person investigations. "Frank Morrison is still alive," she wrote in the book's conclusion. "He's serving his time in the Iowa State Penitentiary, and every day he wakes up knowing where these women are while their families wake up with empty chairs at their tables. Someday someone will break through his wall of silence. Someday these families will have answers." But as 2010 approached, marking 15 years since Sarah's disappearance, that someday seemed increasingly distant. Frank Morrison had suffered a mild heart attack in 2008 and was in declining health. Prison officials worried that he might die without ever revealing his secrets, taking the truth about 7 missing women to his grave. It was around this time that strange reports began surfacing from other inmates at the Iowa State Penitentiary. Guards noted that Frank had started talking in his sleep, often calling out names and locations in distressed tones. Dr. Sandra Reeves, the prison's head psychologist, began documenting these episodes. "He's experiencing what appears to be guilt-induced nightmares," she reported to the warden. "Subjects experiencing severe psychological trauma sometimes develop sleep disorders later in life, especially when their physical health begins to decline. The psychological walls they've built can start to crumble." Prison chaplain Father Thomas McKenna also noticed changes in Frank's behavior. "He's been asking about confession," the priest told Dr. Reeves. "Not formal confession, you understand. But he's been asking hypothetical questions about forgiveness, about whether God can forgive someone who's done terrible things. It's the first time in 15 years that he's shown any interest in spiritual matters." These developments reached Agent Morrison, now retired but still following the case closely. She contacted the prison warden and requested permission to interview Frank again, despite his continued refusal to speak with law enforcement. The warden agreed, noting that Frank's health was deteriorating and his behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. "He's not the same man we locked up 15 years ago," Warden James Collins told Morrison. "Something's eating at him from the inside, and frankly, I think he wants to talk. He just doesn't know how to start." As 2015 approached, marking the 20th anniversary of Sarah's disappearance, the case remained officially unsolved despite Frank Morrison's conviction. The Chen family had settled into a routine of grief, marking each anniversary with a private ceremony and continuing their advocacy work. Little Sarah Elizabeth, now 19 and a nursing student herself, had grown up feeling connected to an aunt she'd never met, but whose legacy of compassion had shaped her own career choice. None of them could have imagined that the breakthrough they'd been waiting for would come not from Frank Morrison's confession, not from new evidence, but from the dreams of a patient in a psychiatric hospital in Des Moines, Iowa. Dreams so vivid and specific that they would reopen the case and finally lead investigators to the truth about what happened on that foggy October night, 29 years earlier. The patient's name was Dorothy Kellerman, the same woman who had written the letter of gratitude to Sarah Chen, found in Frank Morrison's collection of trophies. Dorothy had been battling severe mental illness for decades, but her dreams about Sarah would prove to be the key that unlocked a mystery that had haunted Iowa for nearly 3 decades. Dorothy Kellerman had been a patient at the Iowa Mental Health Institute in Des Moines for 8 years when the dreams began. At 67, she suffered from severe bipolar disorder, complicated by early-stage dementia, conditions that had progressively worsened since her husband's death in 2010. Her adult children, Mark and Patricia, visited regularly, but had grown accustomed to their mother's confused stories and fragmented memories. The dreams started in September 2024, 29 years after Sarah Chen's disappearance. At first, they seemed like typical products of Dorothy's deteriorating mental state, vivid but nonsensical narratives mixing past and present, real people and imaginary figures. But Dr. Amanda Foster, Dorothy's psychiatrist, began to notice unusual patterns in these particular dreams. She would wake up crying, Dr. Foster noted in her patient records. She'd talk about the angel nurse who was trapped and couldn't get home. The level of detail was remarkable for someone with her cognitive impairment. She described specific medical procedures, hospital layouts, even uniforms that matched those worn at St. Mary's Hospital in the 1990s. What made Dr. Foster pay closer attention was Dorothy's insistence on specific names and locations. She repeatedly mentioned Sarah and Frank, describing scenarios that seemed rooted in actual memories rather than dementia-induced fantasies. When Dorothy's daughter Patricia visited on October 15, 2024, exactly 29 years after Sarah's disappearance, her mother grabbed her hand with surprising strength. "Patricia, you have to call someone," Dorothy said, her eyes clearer than they'd been in months. "Sarah is still waiting. She's been waiting so long, and Frank won't tell them where she is. I know where she is. I've seen her in my dreams, and she showed me." Patricia had heard variations of this story for weeks, but something about her mother's tone that day was different. Dorothy seemed lucid, focused, almost desperate in her need to communicate. Against her better judgment, Patricia decided to humor her mother's request. "Okay, Mom. Who should I call?" "The police, the FBI lady who wrote the book. They need to know about the old silo. Sarah keeps showing me the silo where the corn used to be stored. It's not on Frank's farm. It's on the neighbor's land. But Frank knew about it. She's been there all this time." Patricia Kellerman left the mental health facility that day with a mixture of skepticism and unease. She'd grown up in Cedar Rapids and remembered the Sarah Chen case well. Her mother had indeed been a patient at St. Mary's Hospital in 1995, and Patricia recalled her writing a letter to one of the nurses who had been particularly kind to her. But the idea that her delusional mother could have insights into a decades-old mystery seemed absurd. Still, something nagged at Patricia as she drove back to her home in West Des Moines. That evening, she found herself searching online for information about the Sarah Chen case. She discovered Agent Morrison's book and was surprised to learn that the retired FBI agent still lived in Iowa, in a small town called Marengo, about an hour from Des Moines. On impulse, Patricia called the Marengo Police Department and asked to speak with someone about the Sarah Chen case. The dispatcher connected her with Chief Robert Hayes, who listened politely to her story before explaining that the case was closed as far as local law enforcement was concerned. "Ma'am, I understand you want to help," Chief Hayes said, "but we get calls about this case pretty regularly. Your mother's been through a lot, and sometimes people with mental health issues believe they have information about famous cases. It's actually pretty common." But something about Patricia's call bothered Chief Hayes enough that he decided to contact Agent Morrison directly. Rebecca Morrison, now 72 and officially retired for 12 years, still maintained an office in her basement where she kept files on unsolved cases. The Sarah Chen investigation took up 3 entire filing cabinets. "Chief Hayes called me on October 18th, Agent Morrison later testified. He said he probably shouldn't be bothering me, but there was something about this woman's story that felt different. I've gotten hundreds of calls over the years from people claiming to have information about Sarah and the other missing women. Most are well-meaning but unhelpful. But the detail about the silo caught my attention. Agent Morrison had investigated every structure within a 50-mile radius of where Sarah's car was found, including dozens of old silos scattered across the rural landscape. But her search had focused primarily on Frank Morrison's property and the immediately adjacent farms. The idea that he might have used a more distant location hadn't been fully explored. "I decided to drive up to Des Moines and talk to Dorothy myself," Morrison explained. "I've learned over the years that sometimes the most unlikely sources provide the most valuable information. And frankly, after 29 years, I was willing to listen to anyone who might have insights into this case." Agent Morrison met with Dorothy Kellerman on October 22, 2024. Dr. Foster was present during the interview, along with Patricia and Mark Kellerman. Dorothy was having what Dr. Foster described as a lucid interval, periods when her dementia symptoms temporarily improved and her thinking became clearer. "I remember Sarah from the hospital," Dorothy told Morrison. "She was so kind to me when I was scared. I wrote her a letter afterward because I wanted her to know how much her care meant to me. I heard about her disappearance on the news, and it broke my heart." "Tell me about your dreams, Dorothy." Dorothy's expression grew distant. "They started about a month ago. Sarah comes to me, and she's not angry or sad. She's peaceful, but she wants to go home. She shows me this place, an old concrete silo with metal rungs on the side. It's partially collapsed, and there are trees growing around it. She says Frank put her there and then forgot about her, but she's ready to be found now. Can you describe the location of this silo?" "It's near water, a creek or small river. There's a red barn in the distance, and I can see a water tower with writing on it, but I can't make out the words. The silo is hidden by trees, which is why no one found it. Sarah says it used to be part of a dairy farm, but the family moved away years ago." Agent Morrison felt the familiar tingle of recognition that came with potentially significant leads. Dorothy's description was specific enough to be actionable, but not so detailed that it seemed fabricated. More importantly, Dorothy mentioned details about Sarah's personality and hospital demeanor that matched what Morrison knew from her investigation. "Dorothy, Has anyone ever told you details about the Sarah Chen case? No, dear. I don't watch the news much anymore. It upsets me. But Sarah, she tells me things in my dreams. She says she tried to fight Frank, but he was too strong. She says she's not afraid anymore, but she wants her family to know what happened to her. Doctor. Foster interrupted the interview to check on Dorothy's cognitive state. Her descriptions have been remarkably consistent, she told Morrison. Usually, patients with her condition tell different versions of the same story each time, but for the past month, Dorothy's account of these dreams has remained virtually identical. Agent Morrison left the mental health facility that day with mixed feelings. Her investigative experience told her that Dorothy's story was likely the product of mental illness, combined with half-remembered news reports from decades earlier. But her instincts, honed by 40 years of law enforcement work, suggested that sometimes truth emerged from the most unexpected sources. I decided to do some preliminary research before involving current law enforcement, Morrison later explained. If Dorothy's description led to a viable location, I could present a complete case to investigators. If not, I could spare everyone's time and avoid giving false hope to the families. Using county records and historical aerial photographs, Morrison began mapping every abandoned silo within a 100-mile radius of Cedar Rapids. She cross-referenced these locations with Dorothy's description, near water, with a red barn visible on former dairy farm property. By early November, she had identified 17 potential sites that met the basic criteria. The breakthrough came when Morrison consulted with Harold Kozlowski, the farmer who had originally found Sarah's abandoned car. Now 81 and still living on his farm, Harold had an encyclopedic knowledge of the local agricultural history. "You're talking about the old Brennan place," he told Morrison when she described Dorothy's vision. Irish family that ran dairy cattle from the 1950s through the early 1980s. Had a concrete silo that got damaged in a tornado around 1983. Family couldn't afford to repair it, so they just abandoned it when they switched to corn. Property's been through several owners since then, but that silo is still there, hidden in a grove of trees about half a mile from Lime Creek. Harold's description matched Dorothy's dream with startling accuracy. The Brennan farm was located 6 miles northeast of Frank Morrison's family property, accessible via back roads that Frank would have known from his childhood in the area. More significantly, aerial photographs from the 1990s showed a red barn on an adjacent property and a water tower in the nearby town of Coggan, details that Dorothy had somehow incorporated into her dreams. Agent Morrison contacted current Lynn County Sheriff Maria Rodriguez on November 15, 2024. Sheriff Rodriguez had been a deputy during the original investigation and remembered the case well. She agreed to accompany Morrison to the Brennan property for an initial assessment. "I'll be honest," Sheriff Rodriguez told Morrison as they drove toward the site. "I'm skeptical about psychic dreams and deathbed confessions and all that, but I've seen enough strange things in 30 years of law enforcement to keep an open mind. And if there's even a chance that Dorothy Kellerman's dreams can bring closure to the Chen family, we have to investigate." The old Brennan silo stood exactly where Dorothy had described it. Partially hidden by 30 years of tree growth and surrounded by the remnants of abandoned farm buildings, the concrete structure was about 40 feet tall and 12 feet in diameter, with a large crack running down one side from what Harold had said was tornado damage in 1983. Agent Morrison and Sheriff Rodriguez approached the silo with a mixture of hope and dread. If Dorothy's dreams proved accurate, they were about to solve one of Iowa's most notorious cold cases. But they were also about to disturb what might be the final resting place of a young woman whose only crime had been caring too much about her patients and working too late on a foggy October night 29 years earlier. The excavation of the Brennan silo began on November 20th, 2024, almost exactly 29 years after Sarah Chen's disappearance. A full forensic team from the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation arrived at dawn, along with specialized equipment for conducting archaeological-style excavations in confined spaces. Agent Morrison, despite her retirement, was granted permission to observe the process. Sheriff Rodriguez had contacted the Chen family the previous evening, preparing them for the possibility that their long search might finally end. David Chen, now 78 and using a walker, made the trip from California with his daughter Jenny, now 55, and a successful pediatric nurse practitioner. Helen Chen had passed away in 2019, never knowing what happened to her daughter, but never giving up hope that someday the truth would emerge. "Mom always said Sarah would find a way to come home," Jenny told reporters gathered at the scene. "She used to say that Sarah was too stubborn to stay lost forever. If these dreams somehow led us to her, Mom would say it was exactly the kind of thing Sarah would figure out how to do." The silo's interior was filled with decades of debris, fallen concrete, organic matter, and sediment that had accumulated over nearly 30 years. The forensic team worked methodically, documenting each layer and carefully screening every scoop of material for potential evidence. Dr. Emily Rodriguez, no relation to the sheriff, the state's chief forensic anthropologist, supervised the delicate process of excavation. By noon, the team had worked their way down about 8 feet into the silo's interior. It was Dr. Rodriguez who made the first significant discovery, a fragment of fabric that appeared to be from a hospital uniform, the distinctive light blue color still partially visible despite decades of exposure to moisture and decay. "We have something," Dr. Rodriguez called out to the assembled investigators. "Fabric consistent with medical scrubs, approximately 8 feet down from the current ground level." The excavation pace slowed as the team reached what appeared to be the primary deposit level. Working with brushes and small tools, they began uncovering what were unmistakably human remains, along with personal items that would soon be identified as belonging to Sarah Chen. Agent Morrison watched from the perimeter, her emotions a mixture of vindication and profound sadness. After 29 years of wondering, of following false leads and interviewing uncooperative suspects, the truth was finally emerging from a concrete tomb hidden in an Iowa cornfield. "It's her," Dr. Rodriguez confirmed after examining dental records provided by the Chen family. "The remains are consistent with a 26-year-old Asian female, and the dental match is positive. We've found Sarah Chen." No. The scene around the silo erupted in controlled activity as investigators processed the discovery. David Chen sat in his wheelchair, tears streaming down his face, while Jenny held his hand and spoke quietly to reporters about finally being able to bring her sister home for burial. But the investigation was far from over. The forensic team's careful excavation revealed evidence that would prove crucial in understanding exactly what had happened on October 15, 1995. Sarah's remains showed signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. Her broken jade bracelet was found among the debris, along with her hospital ID badge and the keys to her Honda Civic. Most significantly, the team discovered something that connected the crime directly to Frank Morrison. A security badge from St. Mary's Hospital with Morrison's name and photograph on it. The badge was dated 1995 and showed signs of having been torn from a uniform, suggesting it had been lost during a struggle. Morrison must have realized he'd lost the badge after disposing of Sarah's body, Detective Torres, now a captain with the Lynn County Sheriff's Department, explained to the media. He probably couldn't risk returning to look for it, so he reported it as lost or stolen and requested a replacement. Hospital records confirmed that Frank Morrison had indeed reported his security badge missing on October 17, 1995, 2 days after Sarah's disappearance. He'd claimed it must have fallen off during his rounds, and a replacement badge was issued without question, a detail that investigators had noted during the original investigation but hadn't been able to connect to the crime. The discovery of Sarah's remains also provided answers about the timeline of events on that October night. Forensic analysis suggested that Sarah had been killed shortly after her abduction, probably within an hour of leaving the hospital. This meant that Frank Morrison had acted quickly and decisively, supporting investigators' theories that he had planned the attack in advance. Dr. Torres, the prison psychologist who had evaluated Frank Morrison years earlier, offered his perspective on the new evidence. Morrison was a classic organized offender. He planned his crimes carefully, chose isolated locations, and took steps to avoid detection. The fact that he concealed Sarah's body so effectively for 29 years demonstrates the level of premeditation involved. On November 25th, 5 days after the discovery of Sarah's remains, Sheriff Rodriguez and Agent Morrison traveled to the Iowa State Penitentiary to confront Frank Morrison with the new evidence. Now 68 and suffering from advanced heart disease, Morrison was a shadow of the man who had been arrested in 1995. "Frank, we found her," Agent Morrison said simply as she sat across from him in the prison interview room. "We found Sarah Chen. She was in the old Brennan silo, just like Dorothy Kellerman said she would be." For the first time in 29 years, Frank Morrison's carefully constructed facade cracked. His face went pale, and his hands began to shake as he processed what Morrison had told him. "Dorothy's still alive?" he asked quietly. "Yes, Frank. She's been having dreams about Sarah, dreams that led us right to her. Dorothy remembers you from the hospital, remembers how you watched Sarah during her rounds. She says Sarah visited her in dreams and showed her where you put her." Morrison's emotional walls finally collapsed. The man who had maintained his innocence for nearly 3 decades began to sob, his body shaking with the weight of secrets he'd carried for so long. "I never meant for it to happen," he whispered. "I just wanted to talk to her, to tell her how much I admired her work. But when I approached her in the parking lot, she got scared and started to run. I panicked and hit her with a tire iron I kept in my truck. It all happened so fast." The confession continued for 2 hours, with Morrison providing details that only the killer could have known. He described following Sarah from the hospital, forcing her car off the road with his truck, and then driving her body to the abandoned silo in a moment of desperation. He'd known about the location from his childhood when he'd explored the abandoned farm buildings with his friends. "I threw her badge and my badge down there with her," he admitted. "I was in shock, not thinking clearly. When I realized I'd lost my badge, I couldn't risk going back to look for it." Frank Morrison also confessed to the other 6 disappearances that investigators had linked to his employment history. The admission brought closure to families across the Midwest who had been waiting for answers for decades. He provided locations for 4 of the other victims, though 2 remained missing due to his failing memory about specific details. The Chen family held a memorial service for Sarah on December 15, 2024, exactly 2 months after her remains were discovered. The service was held at the same church where they had gathered for countless prayer vigils during the years of uncertainty. Sarah was finally laid to rest next to her mother, who had died still hoping for answers that would now never come. Dorothy Kellerman, despite her declining mental state, seemed at peace after the discovery. Her dreams about Sarah stopped completely, and Dr. Foster noted a marked improvement in her overall anxiety levels. Patricia Kellerman told reporters that her mother seemed to understand, on some level, that she had helped bring Sarah home. "Mom keeps saying that the angel nurse can rest now," Patricia explained. "She doesn't remember the details of what happened, but she seems to know that Sarah isn't lost anymore." Frank Morrison died in prison on January 8, 2025, less than 2 months after his confession. His death certificate listed heart failure as the cause, but those who had worked the case believed that the weight of his guilt had finally claimed him. With his death, the last direct connection to the crimes was severed, but the healing for the families had finally begun. Agent Morrison, now 73, found herself reflecting on the strange turn of events that had brought closure to the case that had defined much of her career. In interviews following the discovery, she often spoke about the mysterious nature of Dorothy Kellerman's dreams and what they might represent. "I'm a skeptical person by nature," Morrison told a reporter from the Cedar Rapids Gazette. "I don't believe in psychic phenomena or supernatural communications. But I also can't explain how a woman with severe dementia could provide specific, accurate details about a crime scene she'd never visited. Maybe Dorothy's dreams were the product of forgotten memories and subconscious deductions. Maybe they were something more. All I know is that they brought Sarah Chen home to her family, and sometimes that's all that matters." The case officially closed on February 1, 2025, marking the end of one of Iowa's longest-running missing person investigations. Sarah Chen's story became a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of never giving up hope, and the mysterious ways that truth sometimes emerges from the most unexpected sources. In the end, it took the dreams of a mentally ill woman to solve a crime that had baffled investigators for nearly 3 decades. And somewhere in the intersection between science and mystery, between logic and faith, Sarah Chen had finally found her way home to the family who had never stopped believing she would return.